Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the YouTube channel of All Saints with Holy Trinity on this really rather cold and snowy day here in the Midlands. It's really nice to welcome you to this online midweek Muse. No, Ministers Muse we call it, but it's on a Tuesday, it's nearly midweek. So if you've never been here before, let me introduce myself to you. My name is Wendy and I'm the rector of All Saints with Holy Trinity, which is the historic parish church of Loughborough, a university town not far from Leicester. And not quite a year ago, but back in the first lockdown, I decided to take some of my sermon writing and preaching preparation online and talk to colleagues, old and new, people from different church traditions and contexts, to take a look at the scripture readings coming up on Sunday. At All Saints, we generally follow what's called the Revised Common Lectionary, which is a pattern of readings that over a 3-year cycle takes you through sort of the major theological themes and the different books of the Bible. So that's our practice, and each week I meet with different people who are going to take a look at those with me. Sometimes they themselves are preparing sermons on those texts, for others they're not, so they just sort of use their imaginations into that. But we have a conversation about it. We look and we consider together what God might be saying. I'm a great believer that we hear from God in community. So the best way to read scripture is with others. As we listen to others' voices, we hear best what the Spirit might be saying. I also like other people to do some thinking for me, then I can pitch their ideas. So no pressure to my guests for today. But I will reveal my guest to you. I'm joined by some familiar faces who've all done the Muse with me before. And just to say, if you are watching with us live this Tuesday lunchtime, do please say hello in the comments and join in with the conversation. We'd love you to be part of this. Share what you're thinking as you read the passages and any questions you have and so on. So while my guests say hello, I'm going to pop into the chat what we're looking at today, and we really look forward to musing with you together on the scriptures. Thanks ever so much, Alison. Take it away.
Hi everybody, nice to be back again for Ministers Muse. I am over in East Leicestershire, tiny villages where I'm vicar. Currently, tiny villages under quite a lot of snow, so I'm quite excited. I'll be putting on my wellies and my warm coat and going out for a long walk later on this afternoon in the glorious, beautiful East Leicestershire countryside.
Thanks, Alison. My name's Andy Smith. I'm based up in northwest Leicestershire. So northwest, we're virtually in Derbyshire, to be honest, or Staffordshire or Warwickshire. I am a lay minister, so most of my time is actually spent working. I run my own small business and I work with people trying to help them work through what they really want to do and to make the most of their potential. So I work as a coach and a consultant, but I'm also a lay reader. I was licensed in 2013 and minister here in the Flagstaff family of churches. So 2 churches here in the market town of Ashby de la Zouch. And then we also minister and support 5 benefices out in the villages that surround Ashby. And when it comes to snow, I grew up in South Devon, about 4 miles from the coast. So I still find it astonishing when it snows, but also slightly cold. So I like to stand at the window and look at the pretty white stuff.
Great. Thanks, Andy. I was really excited to be joining with Andy Smith today because my youth leader growing up was called the same name, but it turns out that he wasn't my youth leader. Anyway, my name's David. I am the head of the Mission Enabler team for the Diocese of Guildford, so I'm the kind of token southerner on the call today. My context for the diocese is quite villagey and quite rural, but it is nothing like Andy or Alison's context. So I worship, work and do my thing in Tongham, which is a village of currently a couple of thousand people with a full-time incumbent who I work very closely with, but I do that as a volunteer. We're expecting another couple of thousand houses to come to our village over the next few years, so we're in a context that's about to change quite a lot. So yeah, exciting times for us as a church. My snow thing, I grew up in the Cotswolds, so Surrey is a constant source of disappointment to me in the snow. There's no hills to sledge down, and those there are hills on, there's trees everywhere, so you die. So I'm constantly disappointed in the snow, but Wendy.
Thank you. Constantly disappointed in Surrey. Maybe that should be your strapline, David. Welcome everyone. Lots of folks on the chat today. Rachel's here, Elizabeth, Michelle, and Sue, Chris, and Hannah. So welcome everyone. Do please chip in as we come to this Sunday. As has already come up in the chat, this Sunday, sometimes called Transfiguration Sunday. Some of us might be marking Racial Justice Sunday in our church. We might be marking it as the Sunday before Lent. So there are lots of ways that we get into these passages, but we come to these scriptures and we think, what is it that we might be preaching on? How might we tease out these texts for the particular context that we are preaching, either in the flesh, via a live stream, via a pre-record, by a play, who knows, a semaphore, puppetry, however it is we're communicating. We begin by diving into the scriptures. So let's make a start, and we're going to go first in with the gospel reading, which is Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 9, and it is an account of the Transfiguration. If you're in your mid-40s like I am, you may remember the Ready Brek advert back in the day of the glowing Ready Brek figure, which may have been an illustration you may have heard in a sermon of the past. It comes after Jesus is foretelling his death and resurrection, and Peter's revelation that Jesus is the Christ, and then 6 days later the passage starts. They're up a hill and there's this transfiguring moment. Andy, you read this passage. Are you transfigured by it? Do you have a moment of epiphany? Where do you go? You'll need to unmute. That's the first the first thing you need to do.
Excellent. I haven't done that for quite a while, actually. Happy days. This is going to go really well. Well, in fact, went nearly as well as when I, went down with that great lectionary lottery feeling, because I was conscious that it was Valentine's Day, and then I turned and I discovered, yes, Wendy, yeah, Valentine's Day. And I discovered there's the Transfiguration and Elijah and Elisha wandering around in another bizarre session. So I'm not entirely sure I should be referencing Valentine's Day, because I am actually preaching on Sunday. And the kind of things I took out from it, like you've just said in your introduction, it comes 6 days after Jesus has been sort of asking his disciples who they think he is, and Peter certainly reveals who he thinks he is. I was struck by the fact that it was that kind of inner circle of leaders within the apostles who Jesus takes up the mountain with him again. So James and John and Peter, who also witnessed Jairus' daughter and were with him in Gethsemane. We then get this almost completely underplayed description of the Transfiguration. I mean, it's just impossible to imagine the Transfiguration. Funnily enough, the Ready Brek idea had occurred to me, but clearly that's not a new and inspirational reference. So, given the age of my congregation, I might have to go back to the drawing board. And I think it's clearly really, really significant, or it seems significant to me, that we have Elijah and Moses there, and that led me to think about that passage from our liturgy, our communion liturgy, about these two commandments, completing all of the law and the prophets, and the kind of something that I think, really, really going to keep coming back to as I prepare to preach is this notion of succession of leadership, and how, as we move through leadership, actually the role and the challenge facing those who are left to lead changes. But just that presence of Moses, Elijah, Jesus as the meeting of heaven and earth, and then three people who all of whom were to go on clearly to be extraordinarily significant in the leadership of the early church, in the development of our faith. Then we have one of those great Peter moments. So Peter, absolutely frit large, decides to break out the concessionary tents and the burger stalls. It's Moses and Elijah. Let's have a festival, because I really don't know what to do. And for me, then the key thing really is, as Peter's thinking about, let's soak this up, blam, they're back in the here and now, and we get that voice of God echoing the words from Jesus' baptism. But then for me, the key to this is listen to him. Again, reiterating that point about Jesus as God's messenger, as well as, you know, Jesus as God. So out of all that, what's going through my head is succession and leadership. I keep on coming back to the difference between transfiguration and transformation. So transfiguration is changing the appearance, revealing what's inside. And again, there's something in there for me. A huge part of popular culture these days seems to be about this desire to be something other than what we are and to transform ourselves. And, you know, 9 easy ways to pull the hot guy or the hot gal or whatever. And actually, should we be thinking more about, we are called to be something, we are given gifts, and do we need to be thinking about how we reveal and understand what they are rather than seeking transformation? And as I say, that whole thing about succession and leadership, and what does that mean for us as we now get quite deeper into the 21st century, but certainly we start to glimpse the potential end of post-pandemic, and what will that mean for us and for our congregations in terms of leading and developing the church. So there's quite a lot going on, really, and I haven't quite alighted on where I'm going with that. I'm really looking forward to Minister's Views today, Wendy, because I think, maybe I'll come out of this with some clarity.
Oh, in my experience, you end up with more confusion. I was really struck there because, of course, I hadn't noticed it was Valentine's Day because I'm not very romantic. But I'd also, and we're doing Racial Justice Sunday. But it occurs to me, I wonder if you were using that as a theme. And in some parishes and contexts, you know, it's useful to use the sort of the secular feast. I know Saint Valentine, but you know, those kind of things. And the phrase that came to mind is this is what love looks like, and whether you could preach around that, particularly if you brought in what happens before, and then of course Jesus, you know, when that whole phrase, listen to him, and of course what Jesus was going to do, and that love wasn't just going to be the staying on the mountain. And that would possibly be where I would go with it, maybe. I was also really struck by your thing about the transfiguration is revealing what is, not sort of pretending to be something else. And I wonder again if that could also play into a love theme, possibly.
Yep.
If that, you know, what does love do if it reveals who we truly are? Some great things to get us going there, Andy. Thank you. Alison, what about for you when you come to this? Where would you go?
I think this is one of those interesting sentences where I do feel like I'm holding kind of quite a, you know, the St. Valentine's Day, the racial justice, and the readings, and sometimes I have a kind of temptation to go, I just think about one of those things. But actually, there is something about, you know, whenever we come to scripture, we come with all that is in any given week or day or whatever that is. So actually holding complex and what feels sometimes to be competing things, and finding the bits where they cross over, as you were just talking about, in terms of what does love look like? Well, actually, that has something to say in terms of Racial Justice Sunday, in terms of our readings, and in terms of Valentine's Day. But the other thing that really strikes me with this is, Andy, you picked up on that bit where, you know, God says, listen to Jesus. And then when they do, Jesus says, don't tell anybody until after the resurrection. Which, of course, at that point, I'm fairly certain would have meant absolutely nothing to the disciples. They're going, till the Son of Man is raised from the dead. Well, what does that mean? So essentially, don't tell anyone until this point when you don't really get what I'm talking about. So you don't really know when that is. And that thing about God's timing and living with an end point when we don't know when the end point is. We've been doing that for quite a while. In a sense, we're still doing that. And just when we think we can glimpse the end of something, I'm never quite certain nowadays, if I'm honest. So that kind of waiting for God's time, even when we can't pinpoint when that will be, because we don't really understand, we're holding kind of confusion and complexity. I just think is quite an interesting thing given our current and our, you know, the last year or so, really. I kind of feel like I've gained a bit of a new understanding of what that means to live in that kind of uncertain. So trusting God entirely, yes, but still I don't have that kind of certainty or ability to plan. And I'm one of those people that kind of lives for, you know, I do holiday plans 18 months ahead, and of course it's all gone. Don't book anything. So very different.
Yeah, it has certainly brought a particular perspective to our reading of the scriptures this year, hasn't it? Certainly. There's been lots of chat in the comments, some lovely sort of thoughts on this passage. I'll give David a chance to get his thoughts together on this. But some folks are really struck by, oh, hi V, nice to see you as well. God repeating his words to Jesus, this is my son. And then Michelle says, this little detail that makes the story believable for me is Peter floundering around. He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And Sue has got a lovely take on this, rather than it being that the idea, which I guess is we probably all preach, that basically Peter wants to stay up there, he misses the point, naughty Peter. She says, I wonder if he was actually just trying to be hospitable. If it was us, we'd probably be getting the kettle on and putting on a cup of tea for everyone, which is a lovely different take on it still. I hadn't really thought of it like that. And poor Peter, he's always trying to do the right thing, but it sometimes goes a bit skew-whiffy, doesn't it, really? David, as you've listened to this conversation, and as you skew-whiffy, it's a technical term, but skew-whiffy. But what skew-whiffy thoughts do you have about this?
Yeah, I like those ideas, and particularly about Peter being hospitable. And to kind of go on from what Alison was saying, really, what I'm drawn to, I'm not a massive fan on preaching sermons on one word, but the word I'm drawn to here is the with. So it comes up in the King's passage we'll get to later on, but there's two withs that are part of the text that I think are quite important. And you've got this idea of Jesus appearing with Moses and Elijah. And then you've also got this idea later on when Moses and Elijah disappear. You have the phrase, suddenly they looked around and there were no longer anyone with them except Jesus. But that's quite an exception, isn't it? There's still Jesus with them. So you're like, well, hang on, except Jesus? He feels like an afterthought, but he's not. He's the point. And I want to develop your thought, really, Alison. Say, actually, yes, of course, we don't know the future, we don't know the time, but we do know who's with us. And I think for me, that's a really important part of the text. And we see it with Elisha and Elijah in the King's passage as well. Who we're with changes everything about what's going on. And that will be my link into the Valentine's Day. So in my context, actually that kind of slightly more secular festival is going to be a bit more present to us than the kind of lectionary. So actually a conversation about Valentine's Day and say, actually, of course it's really problematic. But one of the things that is right about it is the question of who we're with. And actually we can all be with Jesus, because when we're with Jesus, that starts to transfigure everything and it starts to help us to see our worlds in a really different place. So I would kind of try and boil my ideas down. And I think, well, as I preach, I'm learning to say less, believe it or not, and actually kind of hone in on that one idea. What does it mean to be with Jesus? In the text, we have a transfiguration, but what does that mean for us in our Monday to Saturday lives? In our work context or in our family context.
Yeah, thanks, David. Has that brought some light, Andy, into your thinking as you're sort of listening to all this?
Very, very much so. And I think particularly, I really do like that notion that David was just talking about of because I'd also been struck by the witness of Elisha with Elijah through that trek in the King's passage. So that notion of actually what matters at the moment is who we're with, and Jesus is a big part of that. But I'm sure in all of our contexts, we've seen the enormous amount of support that the church family have given to one another in really, really difficult times, and to the community at difficult times as well. And it's an opportunity to reference that in this overall context of it being Valentine's Day as well. Happy.
Good, excellent job done. Back over in the comments again, Krista draws in the sort of the biblical exegesis side of it and talks about reading around the passage, because of course whenever we have a small passage it's always worth seeing what comes before and after. He says always read around. You've got forecast of death and resurrection before, then the transfiguration, then explanation, then a miracle, then another forecast. It's a Markan sandwich, boom boom dish. It is. And the other phrase, because it's biblical studies but not as you know it, V mentions the fact that there's a lot of this sort of the secrecy, and again in Mark's gospel biblical scholars would talk about the messianic secret, and that's a particular thing about Mark's gospel. It's all like, you don't know who Jesus is, and Jesus is revealed, but don't tell anyone. And of course, the oldest ending of Mark's Gospel does just end with empty tomb. And that's the big reveal kind of thing about the direction of travel with Mark's Gospel. Rachel's chipped back in with, I love that it talks about Jesus as the beloved. Now that just rolled too quickly. Stop typing. I can't keep up with you all. And Sue says, just musing about the significance of transfigured as seeing things as they really are. I wonder what our situations now would look like transfigured by the light of heaven. And I wonder if that's something that might help those of us who are preaching through Rachel Justice Sunday might bring a perspective on. What does it mean to see things as they truly are, and shining a light on situations is also about exposing what is wrong. I think there's a challenge for me a little bit in how we deal with all the language of whiteness and light being good as opposed to darkness being bad, and how do we approach that in an age when we're trying to really understand the Black experience in church life. And I think I need to get my head around that before I unpack this scripture more for Sunday. We might come to it with the epistle reading, but I wonder, Andy, you kept mentioning Elijah and Elisha and your kind of leadership trope that you're exploring. So should we go to Kings next? I think David was going to lead for us on this one. Is that right? Yeah, that's right. So 2 Kings chapter 2, 1 to 12. So if you don't know much about the Hebrew scriptures, or we call them the Old Testament scriptures, 2 Kings is like it's the sort of the history bit of Israel and Judah, and it's basically a bit like good king, bad king, good king, bad king, generally bad king. It's the sort of the general trajectory of travel in Israel's history. And then you get the prophets and Elijah and Elisha telling them they're not very good. And into all of this, this particular passage we have is Elijah handing on the mantle to Elisha. My favourite bit of this whole story is a bit that's not in it, because at the end of chapter 2, when Elisha gets to pick up the mantle, he gets teased by some boys who call him bald, and he sets a bear on them. Brilliant story. It's not in the lectionary bit, but this is Elijah and Elisha. David, where did you go to in your mind when you read this passage?
When I read this passage, I love the bear story as well. That's one of my favourites. It's great. But in this passage, I'm always immediately drawn to the kind of the trivia question that this unpacks. So there's always the question about who in the Bible didn't die. And of course everyone goes, oh, Jesus, and then they go, oh no, hang on a minute, that's heresy. And then you end up with Elijah being the answer, and possibly Enoch. There's a kind of a hint of that in Genesis as well. But so once I've got through that piece of trivia, which my congregation do like a bit of trivia, and they like to shout out as they go along, which is always enjoyable. Again, I would be taking this idea of witness from the gospel, and I would be bringing it into this passage, because what we see in Elijah and Elisha's relationship is something that goes beyond a kind of normal friendship or a normal mentorship or something like that. There's a kind of slightly obsessive nature about what Elisha is up to. We have quite a few times in the passage, I will not leave you, I'm not going, I'm staying here, I'm going to watch. And Elijah's like, go away, get out of it. But Elisha persists, I'm carrying on, I'm with you, I'm with you, I'm with you. And other than the sort of, gosh, don't we need an injunction here? There's some kind of question for me around that persistence of pursuit, about saying there's something of Elijah that Elisha can't resist. There's something about what's going on with him that is irresistible. So he's got to stay and see what happens. Lots of challenges for us and for me about saying, is my life like that? But actually, it's not necessarily about Elijah's life. It's about what God is doing in and through his life. So again, I'm slightly prefiguring our epistle that we're coming to, but it's not just about what he does, it's about what's behind the thing. So you've got this transfiguration almost in this passage as well. So you start to say, actually, it's not just he's a spectacular prophet who does some cool stuff. I mean, Elijah at Mount Carmel, favourite passage ever. But it's not about that. It's about what's going on underneath. And that, for me, makes the whole story more approachable. I'm never going to lead the rebellion against the prophets of Baal as they slash themselves and, burn, sacrifices.
Not.
But no, well, not probably. Well, who knows? God could do anything, Wendy. Before you put your eyebrows down. But there's a sense that actually it never was about me anyway, and it's always been about God. So how can I reveal God through the rather more ordinary everyday actions? I think that would be where I would take this passage.
I've got a lovely thought now. If you're on a hill in Surrey, calling down thunder and lightning or something.
Well, if you see me on the news, Wendy, you'll know how it went.
We'll know what happened. I must have. I'm going to come to Andy next, because Andy, you obviously doing some thinking around this, around the leadership thing. And I wrote in my notes this morning. It's a bit Obi-Wan Kenobi and Luke Skywalker, isn't it? There's an element of the master and the apprentice and the handing on. And I was really struck by this sense of the spirit of prophecy and the thing that, so Elisha's asking for this spirit of prophecy. And I wonder again if that's particularly timely for us at the minute. Where do we have that gift of prophecy, and who's passing it on to who, and the tussle with that. But what were your thoughts, Andy, as you were sort of wrestling with this a little bit?
So a couple of things that really, really struck me. One was I like this bit where they get to the Jordan, and you can hear the violin swelling in the background, and it's the big moment. And Elijah says, what can I do for you? And Elisha says, well, I'd like a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah says, well, maybe not. Because actually God calls us for numbers of different reasons, but it's God's plan that we're carrying out. And even though Elijah has been a tremendous and faithful servant, and Elisha will go on, it's in God's hand, and there's a recognition of that, I think, which is particularly relevant to our quite and we all get caught up in the self-centered nature of popular culture. So there's that. There's an echo again of this notion of transfiguration and revealing what's within, to me, in this passage, as David said. Elisha is confirmed as Elijah's successor, but enabled then to go on, because he brings a slightly different. Of all of the Old Testament, the histories is my weakest point. But I do seem to remember somewhere in my study and picking up that Elisha's ministry, although still full of miraculous stuff, also had some significant differences, and that Elisha was slightly less shouty and a little bit more collaborative than Elijah in his relationships with the kings, and went on to minister in a different way, which again brings me back to this notion that we're called to minister and lead in the times that we're kind of dropped into the middle of. And it's important to understand, yes, look to what's gone before for inspiration and for the foundation it's led, but we're actually all called to find our way through the mysteries that we currently exist in. And that it will certainly require us to be brave and courageous, but it needs us to understand, what is it that's within us? What has God called us to be? What are our skills and giftings? And how do we use them in collaboration with those that we walk with?
Yeah, thank you. And maybe we never quite know the impact of our work either, and all those kind of things. I was flicking ahead through Elisha's story, and he dies in chapter 13, if you want to get to that bit. And I do not have all the Bible memorized, just telling you that. And I hadn't really realized this. Apparently when he dies and he's buried, there's another man being buried. A marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. As soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, to life and stood on his feet, which is this little thing about, because it's Elijah who has the vision about bones coming back to life, isn't it, really? But it's fascinating, these little bits of the story. Alison, are you inspired by this? Would you bring this into your preaching on Sunday?
I'm not sure is the honest answer to that. On the will I bring it into the preaching bit? I think for me, I was back with relationship again. I'm thinking about the times when we see this kind of relationship, and I was reminded of Ruth and Naomi, particularly the kind of, don't go, I'll stay with you, no, go on, you go off and do, no, I'm staying. And it's interesting at the end that you get that bit in verse 12. Elisha kept watching out and crying out, Father, Father, the chariots of Israel and horsemen. And I just wonder whether that it kind of reads in a way to me that that kind of father figure. So, like David was saying, more than a mentor, more than a working relationship, but actually something that's got a deeper, closer family feel about it. You know, in the same way as Ruth and Naomi, Elijah and Elisha, I just kind of feel that. And yet, you know, again, picking up on what Andy was just saying, you know, even in actual families, you know, your grown-up children are, you know, very different from their parents. This is a good thing. At least in the case of my children, it's a very good thing. You know, but they go on to do things that when I look at them and as young adults now and think, I couldn't do that. They can do things that I can't do. And there are still some things that I can do that they can't, you know, because we're different people, of course, with different experiences. And so kind of in a leadership role, that thing about, you know, the person who comes next, I mean, poor Elisha had huge shoes to fill. There must have been that kind of bit in him that just kind of thought, I can't do this. I can't do what Elijah's done. I'm not up to this. Yeah. And yet then actually God wasn't calling him to repeat, but to be his own person.
In his own time. Yeah, interestingly, folks who are watching with us this afternoon are having a really long conversation about this whole relationship thing and the wanting to be together and making most of the time. And Rachel too earlier actually said exactly the same thing, Alison, as you, that it reminded her of the Ruth and Naomi, the relationship. Rachel also suggests that maybe in this season of thinking about LGBT History Month, Black History Month in America, the symbol of picking up the mantle and spirit of Elijah is powerful. This sense of, you know, whose mantle do we pick up? But maybe also, are we prepared to put something down as well for the next generation to pick something up? There may be a thread there. And Sue says, Elisha watching reminds me of the apostles watching Jesus at the ascension until the last moment. Of course, there's all of these links, that kind of like these different tropes that come out. Let's, Andy, yeah, come back in, Andy, please.
Sorry, just something that's occurred to me as well. I think it was that comment about, you know, picking up the mantle, but you know, David's already talked about this kind of notion of with and who do we travel with. But I think there's also this question of what do we travel with? And the last 10, 11 months, I think, have caused everyone to be very much aware of what we don't have. And the danger of that is you get into this kind of mindset of lament and what we don't have, and we forget what we do have. And again, perhaps it's an opportunity to encourage people to think about what do we have. So who do we travel with, but what do we travel with as well? What have we been given and what have we got to do the work that we're called to do?
Yeah, thank you. The what and the who. Oh, we do like alliteration. I do like alliteration. Let's park our prophets, hairy and bald, and come to the epistle, which is a little section from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 3 to 6. Although I wish it started at verse 1, because verse 1 is we do not lose heart, and that's a really nice verse to have to preach. We might just stay with that one anyway. But this beautiful little piece, again, obviously picked really to, I think, to reflect the gospel as well, and this thing about the glory of God in Christ. Alison, you were going to kick us off on this one, and you're obviously reflecting on this in the light of Racial Justice Sunday that you're wanting to speak into. Where did you get to as you were beginning to mull this one over?
I think there are a few things that are interesting to me. I with you, I would have rather started with, you know, not losing heart in the beginning, to come straight in at, you know, if the gospel's veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. I was like, oh, joy, that's a lovely place to start. Thanks for that. You know, and the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers. I'm kind of back with Peter thinking, actually, Peter didn't get it. And he wasn't, so that the kind of, I don't want to take the kind of literal, I suppose, with the judgment. It's like, well, if you don't get it, that's because you don't believe and don't have any faith. Clearly, when you look at the disciples, this is not true. And I'm pretty well aware that there's quite a lot of the times when I don't really get it either. It's a lack of understanding rather than a lack of faith. So I was kind of pulling that around and thinking, how do I understand what that's trying to say? And I think for me, there's something about the actually not seeing it can be about being distracted or looking at something else, or, you know, about where our focus is, you know, that can stop us from seeing things. But actually I was really trying to kind of look at the kind of key thing in here, which is about the light that shines in the darkness. Of course, it links to transfiguration. You know, it always takes me straight back to the you know, Christmas readings, you know, and Isaiah's light in the darkness and all of those things. And because it being Racial Justice Sunday, I was looking back at some of Martin Luther King Jr.'s big speeches, just, you know, to hear that voice from that time, from that particular context, and to hear it in our own context and what's happened in the last year really with us. The last speech that he made, which is, it talks about, I've been up to the mountain, so it kind of ties in with the Transfiguration stuff as well. But it also has in there, he talks sort of at the beginning, talks about, you know, if I had the whole of time and God said you can go anywhere, you know, I'd go here, but I wouldn't stop, and I'd go here. And he kind of works his way through kind of great moments of history, and then says, you know, but I'd say to God, can I just have a few years in, you know, the end of the 20th century, you know, exactly the time where God has put him. And he says, no, there's a little bit that just really struck me. He says, now that's a strange statement to make, because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land. Confusion all around. That's a strange statement. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars.
Wow.
Which I just, for me, really kind of spoke alongside that Corinthians and, you know, that the Isaiah passages, that, you know, that the whole biblical references about light in the darkness and God's light in our darkness. But yeah, that thing about actually we see the light most brightly when the darkness is greatest.
Thanks, Alison. I got real goosebumps. It wasn't just the snow. Thank you. That's a really, really profound. I must say, I'm really drawn to those little verses in verse 6. Rachel's put in the comments she doesn't like these ones. Can we do verses 7 to 12 instead? No, Rachel, we can't. But in our church, we use Diddy Disciples, which is amazing liturgy for work with children. Totally recommend them. Go check them out, Diddy. But our closing ritual at the end of Diddy is we light a candle. 1, 2, 3. We light a candle. But anyway, the point is we light our candle to Jesus, light of the world, and we put the light of Christ in our hearts, and we sing "This is the light of mine," which I won't do now for you. And the whole thing is we say wherever we go, whether we're at nursery, at school, whether we're at home, whatever we're doing, we take the light of Christ with us, and then we blow our candle out. And it's a really simple children's ritual, but actually it's so profound, because to really go, do I really carry the light of Christ in me? Because that's quite a responsibility, isn't it? Do I carry the light of Christ with me? Andy, you're looking thoughtful.
No, I just I think it is a responsibility. I also think sometimes people get quite downhearted at you know, the brilliance of the light, going back to the Transfiguration. But I think we need to, you know, remember that what we effectively do is we reflect that light, and therefore, as long as that's what we're doing, again, it's back to, we do what we can do, and we are who we are, and we're reflecting that light. We're not the light, and therefore perhaps just encouraging people to lower their expectations a little bit about how high the bar actually is that we're expected to get over, but then to carry on and do that as well.
Thank you. Yeah. David, what about yourself in this passage?
Yes, last week we were in the first chapter of John, of course, and not only does this passage reflect some of the Isaiah readings, it's like, you know, John chapter 1 verse 5, isn't it? The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not understood it. You can't read this text without immediately being taken back to that. And it's just as Andy was saying, the John text goes on to say, well, of course, we are not the light, but he came as one to testify to the light. So for me, there's a natural flow from last week's gospel into this week's epistle. I know this is a minister's muse. This is designed for people who preach, and this passage speaks directly to those of us who preach, doesn't it? And if I'm allowed to step out of character for a minute, as you know, not being a, you know, put our preaching hat to one side, but for those of us who preach, there's some really important words that we need to meditate on, that I need to meditate on, around we do not preach ourselves, but Christ crucified. And I know in my sermons, I preach Dave because I am honestly hilarious and amazing and brilliant in my own mind. But it turns out my sermon shouldn't be about me. There's a constant battle for me, speaking completely honestly, there's a constant battle between the ego and the sense of servanthood and preaching Christ. And I know that if I get it wrong, particularly if I'm tired or, grumpy, I verge towards the, telling some funny stories that everyone makes me think I'm amazing. When actually, I know that the sermons that we preach that do transform, that do transfigure, are the ones that are not about me, but are about Christ. And obviously everyone who's watching this knows all that already. Obviously your readers and watchers are all very discerning people, but it's worth coming back to, I think, to remind ourselves that when the sermon is terrible, often actually God speaks, because actually it never was about the sermon. Some of my worst sermons, people have come up and said, wow, that changed my life, and I'm like, good grief, that was terrible. And then sometimes I preach in an absolute barnstormer, and I know this made no difference whatsoever, because it is always about Christ. So when we're talking about light, we're talking about transfiguration, we're talking about witness, where I'd really want to go is a preacher is a place of fair humility, to say, actually, the sermon doesn't make any difference to anybody anyway. They never have. No sermon has made a difference to anybody. It's always been Christ through the sermon that makes the difference. And there's a kind of reminder of both the height of that calling, but also the unimportance of that calling. And I think that tension is something that we really need to revel in at the moment, particularly in lockdown. We're preaching mainly from home, and there's always a tempting to, oh look, I've got this cool thing, I'm going to record myself in my understairs cupboard, and it's going to be really hilarious, and all that stuff. But actually, sometimes, just me, okay. But sometimes I think we need to remind ourselves that actually our preaching is always about pointing to Christ, and our worship itself is not about anything other than worship of Christ. That for me just leapt straight off the page. And yes, of course, I'd rather be in verse 7, as Rachel said earlier, because treasures in jars of clay is a much more comfortable thing for me. But I think skipping over the verse where Paul reminds us that actually, David, climb off your ego, let it behind, and actually remember that it never was about you. The group therapy now ends, but
thank you.
Yeah,
thank you. But it's so important, isn't it? And I think as preachers as well, is to allow the text to be at work in you as well. And actually, what really works in you may not be what the sermon that you end up preaching, because actually, but you're allowing that. I just want to bring in I'm going to bring in a few more comments, and I'm going to ask my guests just to sort of almost off the back of our conversations, but also where you are in your own head, what might be shaping up for you for Sunday. But there's been some lovely thoughts coming along the side of all of this, picking up on the light. Hannah says, when we carry the light, we need to remember it shines under its own power. We can use it to see by, which again I think is echoed a bit in what we've been saying. And Sue says, Wendy, you and I do carry it, but sometimes we hide it behind those veils, which is, I can't quite see where the verse is, but it's in this little passage, isn't it? Yeah, thank you. Verse 3, she says, do we make veiled judgments, I wonder, judging who it is safe to remove our veils in front of? I think that's really powerful, Sue. And also that thing as well, who is it easy for to take their veil off, and who actually feels they have to keep themselves hidden, and what are the things that make them have to do that. And Sue then also says, there is a song, we shine in the light of your love like the moon reflects the sun. And Chris says, let light shine out of darkness. The light we preach is love, the love of Jesus, the love of God, and our love for one another and our neighbours. That ideal for Valentine's and Racial Justice Sunday. I'm still not doing Valentine's Day, can't bring myself to do it. And then and Sue says, David, you're right. So I should tell you this, David. Oh, that's no good for your ego, is it? David, you are so right about God speaking profoundly through something that we thought wasn't all that good. Absolutely. We just bring ourselves, or we should just bring ourselves. We've talked about all sorts of things, different threads, through really interesting passages. I think actually you could do lots with any of them actually, but we're coming back to this Sunday. Alison, you've alluded to already, you are preaching on Sunday. Give us an idea of the context. What does preaching look like for you this week? How is that actually going to happen, and in what place?
We do most of our things on Zoom like this, although not live to YouTube. But actually I'm doing the written things that's going to go up on the web so I am, but it's in written form, which is actually it's a slightly different. Sometimes the written form is a written version of what I've said, but this week I'm just doing the written. So that's a slightly different.
Yeah, almost slightly different format.
Yeah. But good, and I think it is this thing about holding together, what's going on. So for me, I think it is about light in the darkness, and that hopefully will hold the Racial Justice Sunday and Valentine's Day, and still being in a global pandemic. Hopefully.
Excellent. And how many words do you write for a written sermon, out of interest, Alison? What do you do?
Good question, to which I have no idea.
You don't know the answer. She says, Wendy, I've not written it yet.
As many as it takes, Wendy Dalrymple.
It has to be
and not one more.
Yeah. I kind of think when you're reading something, you don't want to read loads. So it's kind of a page, because a page feels like a page is okay to read. But that's not really very specific on size of page or font, what I realised. But it kind of has to feel like it's not taking forever to read it. So which is why it's a very different kind of thing, because I think you engage with written stuff differently to conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the form is really impacting how we preach and communicate, isn't it, at the minute? Andy, I think you've said you are preaching, and again, give us context and form and where you.
Yeah. So preaching via the wonderful format of Zoom. Sitting here, it's we gather as a family. So I think we normally have about 75 or 80 viewers. So we do it on Zoom, stream it live on our Facebook page. And I think very much I'm going to go with the theme of love for Valentine's Day. I was quite struck by, I think it was your phrase, really, love coming off the mountain, not staying up there. And these ideas of who do we travel with and what do we travel with are kind of rattling in around there at the moment.
Thank you. So look out for that on what's the name of the Facebook page again?
It is Flagstaff Family Online.
There you go, because you can go anywhere these days. Flagstaff Family Online. Check out their Facebook page and you can join Andy and see how his love sermon shakes up. And David, what about you? Are you preaching this Sunday?
I've got a week off this Sunday. We have a Romanian mission partner joining us. One of the joys of internet is that actually we can have our mission partners joining us and preaching as though they are one of us and in the UK. So he's preaching to us from a rehabilitation place in Romania, which is amazing and so powerful. But if I was preaching, who are you with and what you're going to do about it would be where I would preach. We're really informal in how we do it, so we would use almost that kind of language. I wouldn't want to major on Valentine's Day. It's problematic for a lot of people, but I might kind of acknowledge it and just say, actually, who are we with? And then kind of say, yes, of course, it might be a romantic partner, but actually it might be a family member or whatever. We kind of say there. And I like the idea about what you're going to do about it, the kind of slight alliteration from Andy. But it's kind of saying, what difference does that make? So who are we with and what difference does that make? Yes, it's about our family, but also Jesus is with us in that context. And what difference is that going to make? We keep it really short and simple where we are. So 400 or 500 words, Alison, is what I would write. And then I'd preach for about an hour and a half normally from that.
You'd never have guessed.
I know, surprisingly.
I'm not sure that would make me very popular if I did an hour and a half, if I'm honest.
8 minutes is what I try for.
Thank you. Before I chip in mine, Sue in the comments says, I think I might go along the line of seeing things as they really are and see where that takes me. Thank you, Sue, for that. That's kind of where I am a little bit. I was really struck as you were talking, Alison, actually, with that quote. I might ask you to send it to me about mountains, because I'm sitting with the fact that the Transfiguration Mountain, we're heading to Golgotha though, and we are working with Racial Justice Sunday as a theme that's also going to launch our Lent theme. So I think where my sermon is going is around how we really recognise what is going on and how actually the glory of Christ is kind of what we want, but actually it's the cross that we're headed to. And those things, I need to kind of work out how to piece all that together in my head with all the things I've also explored today. But that's kind of what's bubbling up. And our service is a Zoom live streamed. Oh my Goodness, what a strange world we're living in. Anyway, I want to say a huge thank you to my guests, to David in the south, to Andy sort of in the north, to Alison somewhere else, and to me. I don't want to say thank you to me, that's silly, but thank you to everybody who's joined in the comments. We really hope it's been helpful to you as you've engaged with the scripture, and we hope you have your own moments of transfiguration, of seeing Christ and of being transfigured by him.